On the 2nd day of April, 1801, the cold waters of the Copenhagen harbor reflected a sky heavy with the promise of violence. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, 42 years old and already a legend forged in the fires of the Nile and Cape St. Vincent, stood aboard HMS Elephant, a single remaining eye fixed upon the formidable Danish defenses that stretched before him like a fortress of wood and iron. The Battle of Copenhagen would become one of history's most controversial naval engagements, a clash born not from ancient enmities, but from the brutal mathematics of Napoleonic geopolitics. Denmark, a neutral nation with no quarrel against Britain, found itself trapped in a web spun by greater powers. Its capital about to become the stage for a tragedy that would claim over 6,000 casualties and leave scars upon the conscience of nations. The roots of this dark hour reached back to the winter of 1800, when Tsar Paul, the First of Russia, outraged by Britain's aggressive enforcement of naval supremacy, had formed the League of Armed Neutrality. Sweden, Denmark, and Prussia joined this alliance, pledging to protect their merchant vessels from British searches and seizures. For Britain, fighting for survival against Napoleon Bonaparte's continental empire, this northern coalition represented an existential threat. The Baltic timber and naval stores that fed the Royal Navy's shipyards flowed through these neutral ports. Without them, Britain's wooden walls would crumble. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger and his cabinet faced an agonizing choice: respect neutral rights and risk strategic strangulation, or strike preemptively and violate the very principles of international law Britain claimed to defend. They chose violence. In March of 1801, a massive British fleet under Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, with Nelson as second in command, sailed for the Baltic with orders to dissolve the League by force. Denmark became the first target, not because it posed the greatest threat, but because geography made Copenhagen vulnerable. The Danes, led by Crown Prince Frederick, understood their perilous position. They were not warmongers, but a peaceful maritime nation whose wealth came from trade, not conquest. Frederick, a man of culture and Enlightenment ideals, faced an impossible situation. Surrender to British demands would mean national humiliation and betrayal of their Russian allies. Resistance would invite devastation upon their capital city. Through March, as the British fleet approached, Copenhagen transformed into an armed camp. Civilian homes overlooked harbor defenses where merchants and clerks drilled alongside professional sailors. The Danish navy, though smaller than Britain's, commanded respect. Crown Prince Frederick ordered the construction of a defensive line, 18 warships, and floating batteries. Many of them decommissioned vessels converted into stationary gun platforms, arranged in a formidable arc protecting the harbor entrance. Behind these wooden titans, the Trekroner fortress bristled with heavy artillery. According to historian Andrew Lambert, whose detailed analysis of the battle remains authoritative, the Danish position represented a near-perfect defensive setup, one that should have given even Nelson pause. The approach channels were treacherous, filled with unmarked shoals that could tear the bottom from any ship. The Danish guns, though served by crews mixing professionals with hastily trained volunteers, covered every approach with overlapping fields of fire. Nelson, studying the defenses through his telescope, recognized the deadly efficiency of the Danish arrangement. Yet he also saw something his cautious commander, Admiral Parker, could not: an opportunity. The southernmost Danish ships, while formidable, stood separated from the main fortress complex by distance and difficult waters. A bold thrust into the King's Deep Channel might allow Nelson to engage these vessels individually before the entire Danish line could concentrate its fire. The stage was set for a battle that neither side truly wanted, but from which neither could retreat. As dawn broke on April 2nd, the wind shifted to the south, and Nelson gave the order that would seal the fate of thousands. The morning of April 2nd, 1801, began with a deadly miscalculation that would haunt British sailors for decades. At 9:30, Nelson's squadron of 12 ships of a line, accompanied by frigates and smaller vessels, began their approach through the King's Deep Channel. Almost immediately, HMS Agamemnon, a 74-gun third rate, ran aground on the Middle Ground Shoal, taking no part in the coming slaughter. Two more ships, Bellona and Russell, would soon follow, impaling themselves on underwater sandbanks that Danish pilots had deliberately left unmarked. The Danish defenders watched this chaos with grim satisfaction mixed with dread. They knew what was coming. Commodore Fischer, commanding the defensive line from the Dannebrog, understood that his hodgepodge fleet of block ships and floating batteries could not maneuver like proper warships. His men would fight and die where they stood with no possibility of tactical withdrawal. Many of his crews had never experienced combat. Shopkeepers stood beside seasoned gunners, their hands trembling as they loaded powder and shot into cannons that seemed impossibly huge and loud in practice, yet now appeared pathetically inadequate against the approaching British behemoths. At 10 minutes past 10, the first British broadsides erupted across the water. Hums Edgar, leading Nelson's line, unleashed her guns against the Danish ship Jylland. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that shattered windows across Copenhagen and sent terrified civilians fleeing into the streets. Within minutes, the entire line erupted into a continuous roar of cannon fire that would not cease for the next 4 hours. The violence that unfolded defied comprehension. Unlike the relatively swift naval engagements at Trafalgar or the Nile, Copenhagen became a grinding, stationary slugging match at point-blank range. Ships stood mere yards apart, pouring shot and shell into each other with mechanical brutality. The Danish defenses, which British intelligence had underestimated, fought with ferocious determination. The block ship Wagreen, her crew, including university students and clerks, maintained a devastating fire that killed 68 men aboard HMS Monarch. Nelson himself, aboard HMS Elephant, became locked in a duel with the Danish ships Schlend and Charlotte Amalie. His sailors, veterans of Mediterranean campaigns, found themselves shocked by the intensity of Danish resistance. Cannonballs smashed through oak hulls 3 feet thick, sending deadly showers of wooden splinters that caused more casualties than the iron shot itself. Men were torn apart, decapitated, crushed beneath falling spars and rigging. The decks became slick with blood, forcing gun crews to spread sand to maintain footing. At noon, with the battle raging at its peak, Admiral Parker aboard HMS London, anchored 3 miles north with the reserve squadron, could see only smoke and chaos. The cautious admiral, horrified by what he believed was a disaster unfolding, ordered signal flags raised. Number 39, discontinue the action. It was a command to retreat, to abandon the battle and save what remained of the fleet. Nelson, observing this signal, faced the defining moment of his career. Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, fighting alongside the admiral, watched as Nelson raised his telescope to his blind eye and declared words that would echo through history. "I really do not see the signal. It was deliberate disobedience." A calculated gamble that Nelson's assessment of the battle that the Danes were weakening and victory remained possible trumped his superior's orders. The choice was not heroic, but terrible. Nelson's decision meant that hundreds more men, British and Danish alike, would die in the next hours. The Dannebrog Commodore Fischer's flagship caught fire, her crew suffering appalling casualties as flames consumed the vessel. Fischer himself, wounded and forced to abandon ship, watched his command become a funeral pyre. Similar horrors played out along the entire line as the battleground toward its bloody conclusion, and Nelson's gamble teetered on the knife's edge between vindication and catastrophe. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Copenhagen had transformed into something darker than military engagement. It had become systematic butchery. The Danish defenses, which should have collapsed under the sustained British bombardment, instead displayed a stubborn resilience born of desperation. The crew of the Holsten, reduced to less than half their original numbers, continued firing even as their ship settled lower into the water, flooding from dozens of holes below the waterline. Young Danish midshipmen, some barely 14 years old, carried powder charges through corridors filled with smoke, so thick it choked the breath from their lungs. The Dannebrog's destruction epitomized the horror. As flames engulfed the vessel, wounded sailors faced an impossible choice: burn alive or leap into the frigid harbor waters where British shots still churned the surface. Commodore Fischer's surviving officers attempted to organize an evacuation even as the ship's magazine threatened to explode. When the detonation finally came at 2:30, the blast wave shattered windows across Copenhagen and sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke billowing skyward. 170 men perished in an instant, their bodies never recovered. Nelson, recognizing that further combat would serve no purpose but slaughter, made a decision as controversial as his earlier defiance. At 1:30, He penned a letter to Crown Prince Frederick under a flag of truce. Lord Nelson has directions to spare Denmark, when no longer resisting, but if the firing is continued on the part of Denmark, Lord Nelson will be obliged to set on fire all the floating batteries he has taken, without having the power of saving the brave Danes who have defended them. The message was simultaneously merciful and manipulative, an offer to cease hostilities that also contained an implicit threat of massacre. The circumstances surrounding this letter remain disputed among historians. Some view it as a humanitarian gesture from a commander genuinely distressed by the carnage. Others see calculated cynicism. Nelson's own squadron had suffered grievously, with several ships crippled and hundreds of casualties. The grounding of 3 vessels meant his fighting strength had diminished while Danish fortress artillery remained intact. A prolonged engagement might yet turn disastrous for the British. Crown Prince Frederick faced his own agonizing calculus. His defenses had performed beyond expectation, inflicting casualties that shocked the British command. Yet continuation meant watching Copenhagen burn. The city's wooden structures, packed tightly along the waterfront, represented kindling for a conflagration that could consume thousands of civilians. Frederick, a prince who collected art and patronized philosophers, was being forced to choose between honor and Holocaust. At 2 o'clock, as the Danish flagship's wreckage still burned, Frederick ordered a ceasefire. The guns fell silent gradually, sector by sector, as word spread through the defensive line. The sudden quiet felt unnatural, oppressive. Men who had been loading and firing for 4 hours stood frozen, their ears ringing, their hands blistered and bleeding. Some wept, others simply collapsed from exhaustion. The butcher's bill emerged slowly, counted in shattered bodies and splintered wood. The Danish had lost approximately 1,700 killed and wounded from a defensive force of 5,600, nearly a third of their total strength. British casualties numbered 953 killed and wounded, higher than at the Battle of the Nile. These numbers, clinical in their precision, failed to capture the individual tragedies. The 18-year-old Danish clerk, whose letter home lay unfinished in his pocket, the British midshipman who had lied about his age to join the Navy, and now would never see his 13th birthday. Aboard the battered British ships, surgeons worked through the night, their saws cutting through bone as screaming men were held down by exhausted comrades. The Copenhagen waterfront hospitals overflowed with Danish wounded. Civilians volunteering to provide care, even as they processed the trauma of watching their city nearly destroyed. The battle was over, but its darkest chapters were just beginning. In the days following the Battle of Copenhagen, the full magnitude of the tragedy began to reveal itself through layers of political consequence and human suffering that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The Danish capital, though spared wholesale destruction, bore the psychological scars of a nation violated. Citizens who had watched the battle from rooftops and waterfront streets now walked among returning sailors missing limbs, their faces bearing the 1,000-yard stare of men who had glimpsed hell. Crown Prince Frederick entered negotiations with Admiral Parker and Nelson from a position of defeat, but the terms revealed the moral bankruptcy of Britain's position. Denmark would withdraw from the League of Armed Neutrality and grant Britain access to Baltic shipping routes, the very concessions that might have been achieved through diplomacy without the loss of thousands of lives. The British justified their actions as strategic necessity, but the stench of might makes right diplomacy hung over the proceedings like gunpowder smoke that refused to disperse. The political ramifications rippled outward with devastating effect. Sweden, witnessing Denmark's treatment, understood the implicit threat, but lacked the means to resist. Prussia, farther from British naval power, seethed with impotent rage. Most significantly, Tsar Paul I's murder on March 23rd, 1801, mere days before Copenhagen, had already begun to unravel the League before Nelson fired a shot. The new Tsar Alexander I proved more accommodating to British interests, rendering the entire bloody affair arguably unnecessary. This bitter irony haunted Nelson himself. The Admiral, who had won tactical victory through disobedience and strategic gamble, and his triumph tainted by circumstances beyond his control. His famous signal disobedience, later celebrated in British naval mythology, had committed thousands to death in a battle fought to prevent an alliance that was already collapsing. In private correspondence after the battle, Nelson expressed unusual melancholy, writing that Copenhagen had been the most terrible battle he had experienced, worse even than the Nile's carnage. The Danish perspective revealed deeper tragedy. Commodore Fischer, recovered from his wounds, faced criticism from some quarters for inadequate preparation, though he had performed admirably given his limited resources and mixed crews. The common sailors and volunteer defenders who had fought with such courage found themselves abandoned in peace as they had been in war. Widows and orphans of the killed received meager pensions, if any. The wounded, particularly those crippled permanently, often descended into poverty as Copenhagen's economy struggled to absorb their medical costs and provide employment for men with missing limbs or blinded eyes. The battle's impact on naval warfare doctrine proved equally consequential and troubling. British strategists studied Copenhagen as a template for future preemptive strikes against neutral powers whose neutrality became inconvenient. The concept of blockade and economic warfare, which Copenhagen exemplified, would expand throughout the Napoleonic Wars, entangling neutral shipping from America to Italy in a web of restrictions that punished commerce and civilian populations far removed from battlefields. International law found itself similarly corrupted. The principle of neutral rights, which had been developing through centuries of maritime custom and treaty, suffered a potentially fatal blow at Copenhagen. If Britain, the supposed champion of civilization against Napoleonic tyranny, could attack a neutral capital for purely strategic reasons, what protection remained for smaller nations caught between great power rivalries? The precedent echoed into the 20th century, informing German calculations about Belgian neutrality in 1914 and foreshadowing the total war doctrines that would make civilians explicit targets. For Nelson personally, Copenhagen represented a paradox that tarnished his otherwise brilliant career. He had won the battle through tactical genius and personal courage, yet the victory felt hollow. The Danish defenders had earned his respect in ways that French and Spanish opponents rarely had. These were not enemies by choice or ideology, but victims of circumstance, fighting to defend their homes against unprovoked aggression. Nelson's subsequent elevation to Viscount and national celebration felt disconnected from the battle's grim reality, triumph of necessity, celebrated as glorious achievement. The Battle of Copenhagen's legacy extends far beyond the immediate Napoleonic context, casting shadows across modern international relations and military ethics that remain disturbingly relevant more than 2 centuries later. The fundamental question the battle raises: when, if ever, does strategic necessity justify preemptive violence against neutral parties, has haunted policymakers. From the 20th century's world wars through contemporary conflicts, in the decades following 1801, Danish society processed the trauma through cultural and political transformation. The battle catalyzed Danish nationalism, transforming what had been a relatively cosmopolitan, trade-oriented identity into something harder and more defensive. The humiliation of watching their capital threatened while lacking the military power to prevent foreign dictation of terms created a national consciousness that persisted through the 19th century. When Denmark fought Prussia in 1864 and lost Schleswig-Holstein, the psychological groundwork had been laid 33 years earlier in Copenhagen's harbor. British historians, particularly during the Victorian era, struggled to incorporate Copenhagen into their heroic narrative of Nelson and naval supremacy. Unlike Trafalgar, where Nelson died defeating a clear enemy threatening British survival, Copenhagen offered no comfortable moral clarity. Some chroniclers emphasized Danish perfidy in joining the League, conveniently ignoring Britain's role in provoking neutral powers through aggressive maritime policies. Others focused narrowly on Nelson's tactical brilliance, separating the Admiral's professional competence from questions about the war's justification. Modern historical scholarship, particularly since the mid-20th century, has adopted a more critical perspective. Historians like Andrew Lambert and Roger Knight have examined the battle within its full political context, revealing the degree to which British strategic paranoia and overreaction transformed a manageable diplomatic dispute into unnecessary bloodshed. The British government's failure to seriously pursue diplomatic solutions before resorting to force appears increasingly indefensible when examined alongside the timing of Tsar Paul's assassination and the League's internal instability. The battle's relevance to contemporary international law cannot be overstated. United Nations Charter's restrictions on the use of force, particularly Article 2's prohibition on threats or use of force against the territorial integrity of sovereign states. represent in part a reaction to centuries of great powers treating smaller nations as Copenhagen was treated as pieces on a strategic chessboard, whose sovereignty mattered only when convenient to larger interests. The Baltic states' experiences during World War II, caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, echoed Denmark's impossible position in 1801. From a military ethics perspective, Copenhagen raises profound questions about proportionality and civilian protection. While the battle occurred before the development of formal international humanitarian law, the principles at stake, the obligation to minimize civilian suffering and to ensure military action serves legitimate purposes proportional to human costs apply retrospectively. By these standards, the British decision to bombard Copenhagen appears increasingly difficult to justify. For Denmark specifically, the battle occupies a unique space in national memory, neither forgotten nor celebrated, but rather acknowledged as a moment of national suffering that helped forge modern Danish identity. The Dannebrog's destruction remains symbolically potent, and April 2nd holds a solemn place in Danish historical consciousness. Memorials to the fallen sailors and volunteers, Copenhagen, quiet reminders that neutrality offers no protection when great powers calculate their interests. The ultimate lesson of Copenhagen transcends any single nation's experience. The battle demonstrates how easily strategic logic divorced from moral restraint produces tragedies that serve no one's long-term interests. Britain won the battle, but tarnished its reputation. Denmark suffered devastation that bred lasting resentment. The thousands who died purchased nothing but a temporary adjustment to shipping access that might have been negotiated peacefully. Nelson's tactical genius could not redeem a strategically and morally bankrupt enterprise. As we examine Copenhagen from the vantage of the 21st century, the battle serves as warning rather than inspiration, a reminder that military capability, however brilliantly exercised, cannot substitute for diplomatic wisdom, and that victories purchased through the suffering of those who sought no quarrel offered nothing worthy of celebration.